Hey everyone, Pastor George here with your Theolog for today, and today we're in chapter 9 of The Reason for God, and this is where we've moved into the part where he's trying to prove that the Christian God is God, right? But today he's dealing with a specific problem of moral relativism, and you've probably heard me talk about this before. I've just probably never used those words, at least I don't think I have. But what he points out in this whole section is he points out that people who will claim to have all sorts of moral beliefs about things, but then we'll say, well, everyone kind of just needs to figure out their own thing. We can't really make, say that this thing is better than another thing. But that's ultimately pretty not helpful, because when we say that, our culture values women's rights, for instance, and another culture doesn't, and we can't really say which one is better, right? Most people actually do not act this way, and he uses this as a reason for God, because he says that if we have a conscience at all, that comes from somewhere. And some people will try to root it in biology, for instance, right? So you'll see people make the argument that we evolved to have a conscience, so we have a greater need to work with the community in order to survive. But he points out that if that's the case, then we would see similar kind of moral systems cropping up all over the world, right? But that's not the case. I often you've heard me give it in a sermon before, but just to drive the point home again, is we can say it's bad to murder people, right? But there have been civilizations who have thought it's completely fine to murder people for sport, like the Romans, for instance. And so we have to be really careful when we make claims about what's right and what's wrong, especially if we don't have a God-type figure in our theology and our philosophy, what have you. And he responds to a common critique that he hears a lot of conservatives kind of say, which is, people these days, they don't have any morality, it's all gone. And he says, well, I've worked in New York City for 20 years, or, more than 20 years by this point, and I run into people all the time who believe really strongly in things. And he uses the example of this young couple that he talks to, and they're all well-educated, right? The church that he serves at is definitely on the upper middle class side of the spectrum of church stuff. So, they all have been to college, they're all thinkers, they work in the investment banks, they work in all these different, high-end type of stuff in New York City, right? And he writes this about them, but just to give you a premise, is he's talking to this young couple, and this young couple is insisting that Christianity can't be right because you can't insist that people have these sort of moral, that you can't take your morals and put it on all of humanity. And he responds by saying this. So he writes, all human beings have moral feelings. We call it a conscience. When considering doing something that we feel would be wrong, we tend to refrain. Our moral sense does not stop there, however. We also believe that there are standards that exist apart from us, by which we evaluate moral feelings. Moral obligation is the belief that some things ought not to be done, regardless of how a person feels about them within herself, regardless of what the rest of her community and culture says, and regardless of whether it is in her self-interest or not. The young couple had no doubts that people in other cultures should honor women's rights, for example. And so he gives a very good example right there. So, in the West, we have a very good, I would say morally good, idea of women's rights. But in other cultures in the world, these things do not exist, right? And so we have to be able to say ours is, well, I would say our way of looking at it is more moral. It's superior to other ways of looking at the issue. And so but we have to root that somewhere, right? And we root it, this is especially Protestant of him to root it in our conscience, because Protestants say, if you look at the Word of God and you come away thinking, that is what God is saying and everyone else is doing it wrong, then you have an obligation to do it right? It's all about the conscience. Martin Luther famously made a lot of arguments like this. So that's kind of where we're at. You have to make some sort of moral absolute claims. You have to make claims about things being moral. As soon as you do that, you are showing that there has to be some morality in the world, right? And that morality is God. Then the decision comes as, well, is this the Christian God? And Tim Keller says that, well, we can evaluate all of these systems, but in order to know which one it is, we actually have to look at the historical type of fact and things like that. And so we're going to hopefully hit on that sometime soon, but that's what we talked about today. So hopefully it was interesting for you, and I'll see you guys tomorrow with our next Theolog. So you guys have a wonderful day.